Welcome to our Curious Amalgam, the weekly podcast brought to you by the Antitrust Law section of the American Bar Association. Our Curious Amalgam explores the fascinating and increasingly overlapping world of competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law. Each week, we bring you leading global experts on the most compelling issues of the day. Enjoy the show.
Hello and welcome to Our Curious Amalgam, the podcast from the Antitrust Law section of the American Bar Association. My name is Matthew Hall and today's program is What in the World is Happening with Antitrust Enforcement? Antitrust Cartel Enforcement's Return to Global Scale in 2022. Competition or antitrust law enforcement is carried out by national or in some cases regional enforcers. Yet there is significant cooperation and information exchange between regulators, and often global trends and topics of interest can be identified. These trends and topics are interesting both to global companies and those active on a narrower scale, since enforcement can be against them in the same way. Past performance may not be a guide to the future, but it's still interesting to consider what has been going on and what this might tell us about the future. My co-host today is Jaclyn Phillips. Hello, Jaclyn.
Hi, Matthew.
Well, thank you for coming on again. What are we talking about today, and who is our guest?
So today we have John Terzaken here. John is the global co-chair of Simpson Thacher's Antitrust and Trade Regulation practice. He also held a leading position in the DOJ's Antitrust Division as Director of Criminal Enforcement, where he oversaw the division's criminal enforcement nationwide. Today, he's going to be talking to us about Simpson's 2022 Global Cartel Forecast Report and giving us some insight into what we can expect to see as the year progresses through 2022. And John, we're excited to have you here today and have someone with your expertise walking us through trends that we can expect in enforcement. So welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good to see you both.
Can you tell us a bit about your background in this area?
Sure. So my practice is very classically what you would refer to as sort of contentious regulatory. So it's got three elements to it. We do compliance counseling for clients who have antitrust regulatory issues, also trade regulatory issues. What would be regulatory defense? So facing off against the government or navigating folks through the regulatory process. And then third would be the sort of class action defense, litigation defense that would come off of the back of those regulatory investigations. There's obviously pieces in between, but a lot of what I do for clients is very much what I used to do for the Department of Justice. So that is where I used to wear the prosecution hat and look to pursue those companies and individuals. I now sit on the other side of the table and help them navigate those particular processes.
That's great. And again, I'm really excited to hear what you have to say about these topics, given your experience sitting on both sides of the issues we're about to talk about. So like I mentioned, you recently authored a report looking at global trends in enforcement. Can you tell us a bit about what stood out to you about cartel activity in 2021 as compared to what we saw in 2020, focusing first on a U.S. focus?
Sure. So we do a cartel report each year where we track essentially the fines that are imposed by the various regulatory agencies around the world, really as a proxy for the aggressiveness of enforcement, the amount of enforcement that's going on in the space. So it helps us sort of just look at a metric level, kind of where folks are. It's not a perfect science, of course, because fine figures don't always represent aggressive enforcement. But it's something that at least gives us some trend indicators about where the enforcers may be headed. As far as the U.S., if you look at this past year, again, the fine figures were pretty low comparatively. So if you look back 5 or 6 years, the U.S. was at much higher levels. Those levels have remained low really over the course of the last administration, in and out through the end of this past fiscal year for the Department of Justice. It largely, I think, when you look at those figures, what it sort of reflects is that there's been a very domestic focus of enforcement because the fine figures, while low, represent a lot of different cases. And in fact, if you look at some of the reporting that the Department of Justice has done, they have about 13 trials on at the moment, which is quite extraordinary. So I think, summing it up, we have a lot of activity by the government that really relates to what are sort of smaller commerce kinds of cases, which explains a lot of why You may have a lot of activity, but lower fine figures.
That's really interesting, and I'll put a plug in for your report. There's a really handy graph where we can see all the fine figures compared over the past couple of years. That gives really nice insight into the trends and how we've seen that change. And then, you noted that lower fines don't necessarily mean less enforcement, and I think we definitely see that here. You mentioned there's 13 trials, and that doesn't seem very typical. Is that your sense?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly over the course of the last couple years, I think the focus on those smaller cases has driven a couple different things. One is that you have a lot more activity. So a lot of resources have been put into things like the procurement collusion strike force, which has produced sort of smaller bid rigging cases, other things. And I use the term small, of course, just around the volume of commerce, not necessarily the seriousness of the case. But in terms of the kinds of investment that are required there, you have a lot of government resources going into cases that maybe aren't on a global scale. And so when you have those kinds of resources being put into them, you can expect that on the other side of things, you're also going to have equal resources that are put in on the defense. And when you're talking about people's liberty, some of those cases when there isn't as much commerce at issue, maybe ones where people are willing to try them. That is put to a jury whether or not these are the appropriate kinds of criminal enforcement actions. So I think what we're seeing right now is a byproduct of, frankly, a lot of that domestic focus, whereas in the past, we may have seen a lot of plea agreements and the like. There's a lot more interest at the moment at seeming to contest those cases.
Were you surprised to see a continued focus on domestic trends in 2021? And, why do you think that focus on domestic issues kind of stuck past 2020?
Yeah, I mean, the last administration, I think, particularly around whether you look at geopolitical issues or otherwise, there was a lot of sort of inward looking, a lot of that driven, frankly, by even the pandemic that was unique to the United States. But it resulted in the kinds of things like the procurement collusion strike force. And again, when you invest a lot of time and energy in something looking for potential violations, looking for potential crimes to prosecute, you're likely to find what you're looking for. That is, if you put a lot of investment in one particular sector, you're eventually going to find something that you want to pursue. So I think the investment in the smaller domestic cases is what has resulted in the output that we're seeing now. And so when we look into 2021, I think really what you're realizing is the investment that was made some years ago by the last administration and investigation are now producing the kinds of results we're seeing in 2021. What happens from here forward under the new administration and the new regime, we'll see whether the shift in focus, I know we'll talk about a little later this morning, whether that's going to produce different kinds of cases if we were to talk 2 years from now.
That's really helpful perspective. And, sticking with how we saw trends change from 2020 to 2021, and we look at that more globally, how did the rest of the world compare to the U.S. in that regard?
Yeah, it was very similar. As I mentioned, and I think this, again, you don't have to necessarily look at antitrust to see this trend, but I think a lot of regimes were looking internally, looking at things like procurement collusion and other issues. And so the antitrust prosecutions that they had were similarly scoped, and that is on the smaller end of things. As a result of that, the fine figures generally across other major enforcers, whether you look at Australia or Korea or China, any of the sort of, predominant players out there in the market from a competition enforcement perspective, their fine figures remained relatively low. The one exception to the rule was the European Commission, which actually had a pretty considerable year when you look at least over the past 5 years. They're probably still down over the last 10 years, but they had their highest fine figures this year since 2016, really ramping up in particular around some very large global cases. They are sort of the outlier, if you will, across the world. Otherwise, I think you see a pretty consistent trend across other major regimes.
John, do you think there's any comment here or link to make with the apparent decline in leniency applications? The OECD brought out a report quite recently, February 22, where I don't know if they were lamenting, but they were commenting that in certain jurisdictions, the number of applications has gone way down since 2015, 70% lower in Europe than in 2020 than in 2015. Do you think this is kind of playing out at all, or is there any link to make here?
So there's definitely a correlation. How strong that correlation is, of course, anyone's guess, because none of us are sitting in the chair of the enforcers. I think, though, that the fine figures that we're seeing and the enforcement that we're seeing has more to do with the domestic versus global focus than it does with regard to the leniency applications. I mean, I would suggest that the leniency question really has raised more of a focus of which industries are and what kinds of crimes are ultimately being pursued. That is to say that in the past, when leniency at least was perceived as far more attractive than maybe some of the issues raised today, there were more applications in what you consider to be grayer conduct. So conduct that outside counsel would certainly consider to be one where it wasn't quite clear whether it was criminal, and they would bring it forward for the respective authorities to take a harder look. I think in today's day and age, just given the proliferation of regimes and the collateral consequences that come off the back of those applications, you have a little more considered views in terms of whether or not bringing forward those applications immediately is the right idea. So I don't know that the applications are going down necessarily because people are feeling like they're not going to bring things forward. I think they're just taking more time to evaluate whether it's serious enough or close enough to the mark that they should bring it forward.
Really interesting insight into, all these various things that are happening in this area. And, as we look forward to what we're going to see in 2022, the report, as you mentioned, discusses various trends that practitioners should be looking out for. And I think it would be helpful to, go through each one of those. So turning to labor markets, can you tell us a little bit about what's going on in that space and what we can see going forward?
And all of the areas I think we highlight in the report have a very strong political wind behind them. That's true in the United States. It's true elsewhere. The labor markets are certainly on the top of that list. And a lot of it is relating to the economic recovery coming out of the pandemic, right? We see a lot of discussions now around inflation and other things having to do with labor shortages. And at the same time, you have out there at least a lot of concern in the competition space about whether or not wages are being held down, the ability of employees to move is being suppressed. That's really driving a lot of what's behind the enforcement in the labor space. You've got some very active cases in the U.S., criminal cases that have been brought, really the first criminal cases that we are seeing starting to work themselves through the process after the announcement of the DOJ's guidance back in October of 2016. Those cases have now finally evolved. The DeVita case, the He case, the SCA case. They've got a new investigation and an arrest they made in the aerospace industry. So there's a lot going on at the moment in the U.S. in terms of the criminalization of that kind of conduct that I think is going to really spill out into next year. So we'll learn a lot about the prosecution of those cases in the coming year. I think the trend is the government seems to be doing relatively well in backing up its theory that this conduct should be pursued criminally. That's sort of the big theme takeaway. The other mark I would make more just for the sort of international community outside of the U.S. is we also see a lot of other jurisdictions starting to pay particularized attention to these labor cases. So out of South America and Europe and other places, I think the evolution that we have seen in the United States is coming soon to a theater near you, if you will, in other areas of the world.
Yeah, and a couple of questions on that point. So the report notes that we've seen a lot of these types of cases in the healthcare industry, and that we've seen now our first case outside of healthcare. Is that something we can expect to see, that these types of cases really going into other areas?
There's been a lot of writing that's been done over the years about how cartel investigations are much like the roots and branches of a tree, right? You start at the roots, you grow you grow the base of the tree, and then you have all the branches that come off of it. I think the healthcare space was just the beginning of that. So it grew its own tree. I think you're going to see in a number of other industries, those trees start to grow. We saw it in the aerospace industry. There will likely be more cases that come out of that, is my guess, not just specific to aerospace, but of other adjacent spaces they may relate to. There are also other investigations that, certainly we're aware of, others are aware of, that sort of go broadly outside of both of those spaces that are likely going to percolate and produce investigations and or prosecutions in the not too distant future.
You mentioned also that we see different jurisdictions starting to focus on this type of conduct. Do you think there's any risk of, companies being subject to enforcement in multiple jurisdictions, given that there seems to be a more global focus starting on no poach and wage fixing type conduct?
I think what we're going to see is a lot of information sharing between agencies on enforcement strategies in relation to labor market cases. I don't know that we're going to see a lot of international cartels that would be labor focused. And that's just simply by dint of the nature of the kind of conduct we're talking about, right? Typically, it's going to be very geographically limited in terms of the movement of people. Gets a little bit more difficult to have something that you could really even rationalize as a cartel when people are moving across oceans. So I think in this instance, it's going to be more about coordinating on the international front on theories, enforcement tools, and the like to pursue these kinds of cases, as opposed to necessarily working on the same case.
I guess you could think of some markets, maybe, I don't know, IT professionals or software programmers or something where it might be international. But as you say, John, most of these markets are likely to be local.
Yeah, I think that's right. And look, it's possible. And I think the other thing that the information sharing could certainly produce is, taking again my analogy on the sort of rootstock branch building of a tree, you could have a circumstance where in one investigation in one country into a particular industry, there is reference to similar kinds of approaches and strategies the company is employing in a different jurisdiction. That kind of information would be shared freely. So while it may not necessarily be part of all the same conspiracy, it could be the same actors in multiple jurisdictions. So 100% that could certainly evolve.
And do you think, just talking a little bit more about move to a global focus more generally, do you think that, information sharing between jurisdictions and is going to be, something we see as we move forward into 2022?
Yeah, it's interesting. At the time that we wrote the report, we were looking at things like the executive order that Biden put out back in July, and some of the comments that were being made by Margaret Vestager and other of the competition heads around the world. And there very much seemed to be a want to return to more global coordination than maybe we have seen over the past 4 or 5 years. And that isn't to suggest that there hasn't been. There certainly have been efforts, but I think all of us, again, because of the pandemic and other issues going on, have sort of been inward looking for a variety of different reasons. I think what's interesting now is you're actually seeing for the first time some of what I think is actual practical evidence of the fact that we are returning to more of that. And this comes out post-report, but there was a recent initiative that was just announced relating to supply chain disruptions. So the Department of Justice announced it's working with other enforcers, Australia, the CMA, others to get together to start talking about things that they're seeing, information they're collecting in those markets to pursue potential prosecutions for collusion around supply chain disruptions. So I think very practical evidence that what we thought was coming is actually starting to come.
Yeah, and it's kind of fascinating to see how all these, global events, whether it be the pandemic or the supply chain crisis, are really impacting the antitrust focus, around the world. And, a related issue, in your report, you talk about the procurement space. And what are we seeing there in terms of how antitrust enforcement is in that area?
Yeah, procurement collusion has been hot for all the reasons we talked about. There's been a very domestic focus across a number of regimes. I think it's going to continue to be very hot and actually continue to expand. And the reason is plainly the economic recovery that everyone is going through at the moment, right? The restoration of markets post-pandemic. What that's going to entail is still the continued reinvestment by governments into the economy, right? Trying to get things, infrastructure, other things up and running again. When you have money flowing out of the government, one of the things that the government is very keen to do is to protect and ensure that money is being used appropriately. So we saw this back in the days of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, where there was a lot of money coming out in the Obama administration. There was a big push by the administration to protect against fraud on those funds. The same kinds of efforts and initiatives really are ongoing now. The Procurement Collusion Strike Force in the US, similar kinds of initiatives elsewhere reflect that fact. And I think there'll only be continued investment in that by various jurisdictions.
And when did we kind of start seeing an increase, if you can call it that, in, the strike force's focus to these issues? I think it was late October of last year, a statement about how the strike force is coordinating with different agencies to focus on these issues. Was that something we saw pick up, late last year?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think you'll continue to see cases. I mean, I think if you look across most of the big cases that are out there at the moment, they all have a tinge of the Procurement Collusion Strike Force. And my guess is, and again, they're not necessarily speaking about this specifically, but a lot of the leads that very well may have led to the cases that are going on in the US and through similar initiatives elsewhere were probably born of reports that came in through the Procurement Collusion Strike Force. So issues where you're working in an industry where, of course, the government is much a consumer as there are private consumers. The government is going to have access sometimes to much more detailed information about what may be going on in a market and who's competing in that market can often lead to investigations in the sector. So will we see more of that? Absolutely. In the connection with these various agencies, you can also see across the caseload that they have now all the various kinds of types of products and services that are actually under investigation. Unlike, I would say, prior years, you have a wide panoply of things that are being looked at, from fintech to, consumer protein products to construction to aerospace. In the past, we were all talking about air cargo, and it was pretty much air cargo and air cargo and air cargo, or freight forwarding. And, you go back in time and look at those isolated periods. Today, we're talking about investigations across industries. And I think, again, that's all born of this focus on let's go out there and engage all of these various agencies, these different parts of the economy, and ask them to help us. So it's a help me, help you scenario. And they're getting a lot of help, it seems, from what we can see from this side of the table from those variety of agencies.
I hadn't sort of focused on that, and the, how you, like you said, like if you look at cartel cases in the past, you're focused on, one big industry, and now we have, a whole range of different industries to look into and see how, these investigations will bear out when, applying it to different types of businesses. Have we seen sort of similar focus globally?
Yeah, I think that's also true globally. I mean, again, it's sort of probably a mix of different factors, but certainly the fact that if your cases are not as wide-ranging or as large in the volume sense, then you can do more of them, right? It's the sort of bang for your buck, just as any of us have to do, is you only can do as much work as you have people and resources to do. I think what you're seeing is the division being willing in the US, and I think true of other global enforcers, of spreading those resources around to try to touch these various sectors of the economy to move forward what I think are, the front burner issues, which is economic recovery and protecting government funds and the other kinds of issues that we spotlighted in the report.
Yeah, so it seems like all supporting, lower fines don't necessarily mean less enforcement.
No, 100%. As we said, I mean, it's always it's a proxy to give you a sense of it, but it can be misleading. And I think in this instance, looking at it and saying that must mean there's not a lot of enforcement would be taking the wrong message. It simply means what we're really seeing is cases that may not necessarily have as much commerce at play. It doesn't mean that they don't have a lot of enforcement going on very serious offenses.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of switching gears, because there's a bunch of different trends we have left to talk about. It looks like in some ways current events, the pandemic, the Olympics led to a bit of the focus for procurement collusion, but in some ways they've also had somewhat of an opposite effect. I mean, when you're looking at the pandemic, there were measures put into place so that companies might be able to work jointly to, get medical supplies out and those types of things. And looking at your report on the ESG space, it looks like that might be another area where there might be room for a bit of cooperation there to help companies put forward green goals and things like that. So what can we see there?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting area, and we spotlighted it because of the comments that Margaret Vestager had made. And I think, frankly, the European Union, the EC, really are to credit it, trying to push forward what would be some forward-looking thinking about whether there should be public interest exceptions, if you will, to collaborations among competitors when issues like environment, social governance, the ESG kind of factors are at play. And we see a lot of this really around the sustainability area. And I think everyone in the media is talking about ways in which we can all be better, more sustainable. You run up against very quickly, if you're a corporation, how you're able to do that if you can't build standards, you can't match to standards within an industry. Right? You can have a competitive disadvantage by taking on a sustainability initiative if others don't. I think there's recognition of that, and people are wrestling with how do you balance the interest in not pushing people to an area that would be potentially an offense, a violation, restrain competition, but at the same time encourage them to look at things like sustainability in the public interest. DC's really been leading that, and I think what you're going to see from that, particularly given the strong comments from the White House in the United States and from the top of the echelons at other jurisdictions, I think you're going to see a lot of interest in discussion globally about how there could be a public interest exception. There are certain jurisdictions that have that now. Australia is a good example of that, where you can apply for a public interest exception. We don't really have that in the US, for example. And so I think all of these jurisdictions are going to want to think hard about that. I don't know that any jurisdiction wants to be in the business of telling companies they shouldn't do better as far as environmental, social, or governance issues. I think the latter is the case.
Yeah, and we had a guest on our show who, looked at the EC's initiatives, going forward, and the Green Initiative was a big part of, that report. And it's definitely interesting to look at that and think about how that's going to impact other jurisdictions going forward. And it's really fascinating to see these issues in the competition space for sure, and just applying these principles to, these important issues today. So you also talk about the UK. I know we mentioned the UK. The UK has tried to position itself a bit as as a global cartel enforcer. What have we seen out of the UK's CMA?
Yeah, I think obviously post-Brexit, I think a lot of the interest in the CMA is they're really asserting themselves now as a global enforcer. That is not to suggest they weren't before. There was a lot of cooperation that went on with the CMA even prior to them, leaving the European Union. The distinction now with the difference is because they are not part of the European Union any longer, they aren't going to defer necessarily to the EC taking the lead on particular cases or waiting or adjusting the results of where they go based on what the EC may be doing. And so the real expectation here, based on one, the investments they're making in building up their capacity to be able to enforce these kinds of cases, and two, what I think people are seeing in the market, which is more aggressive enforcement by them and interest in participating more globally, is that they're going to have a seat at the table among global enforcers now. And if there is a concern where products or services are flowing into the UK, people are going to have to be ready to deal with them at arm's length in the same way that they've dealt with the other large enforcers over the course of the number of past years.
Would we expect to see a domestic focus from the CMA, or would we, really expect to see them, branching out and trying to take a more global approach to enforcement?
I think you're going to see a little bit of both. I mean, I would expect there's going to be a lot of domestic cases, and I would just say that because, like everyone else, they're going to be focused on economic recovery coming out of the pandemic. There are going to be a lot of focuses around the construction sector, other areas that would be natural for competition authorities to want to be looking at to make sure that they're operating in a competitive environment. So I think there'll be a lot of domestic cases. What I think you will also see, though, given their willingness and frankly comments about wanting to participate more globally, is as you see a resurgence of global cases, I expect to see them as part of that. Right. So as we see the next big global case, I would suspect that the CMA will be one of the various acronyms that you'll see at the table that people will have to deal with.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And your report notes, too, that now there's risk of, parallel enforcement with the EC and the UK CMA. So do you view that as, kind of a real risk to companies going forward?
Yeah, I mean, that's the let's call it the double-edged sword of great global coordination, right? In one case, it allows authorities to work more, you would hope, more efficiently together to develop facts, develop evidence, to maybe exercise some discretion in terms of enforcement. On the other side of things, for corporations and individuals caught up in some of this conduct, it also means a tremendous amount of navigation around parallel enforcement. You now have with the CMA a separate standalone entity that no longer has to defer to the EC. So we've added yet another significant player from an enforcement perspective that has to be considered in any of that navigation.
And I think the sort of final trend and an area in which, they may have to look out for this global enforcement is financial institutions. Definitely not an area that's necessarily new to being under the microscope, but it looks like there's going to be a bit of a continued focus there.
Yeah, we had it was interesting to see that a lot of the cases, of course, if you look out over the last 5 years, a lot of the big cases that were focused on the things like FX and various bonds cases and other things, that LIBOR cases, benchmarking cases that worked their way through the system, they were sort of the highlight. You did see a downward trend in terms of the number of new areas that were coming to light following those cases. The reason why I think we're spotlighting that financial services may be on the upswing again is not so much that we expect that there be things to find there, but that you have a focus, given economic recovery, by the authorities on wanting to focus on those financial services sectors. The very large investment banks, others in the space, they are going to be critical to any economic recovery. And as a result of that, the kinds of government enforcement, government mechanisms that we talked about in connection with procurement collusion, the same emphasis on making sure those structures are working appropriately are going to be put there. So we've seen some continued enforcement in the space. I would say much of what we have seen over the past year are really legacy investigations. The FX cases, for example, out of the EC, there were some cases out of Mexico. Those are all sort of historic cases. I think what we're spotlighting is our expectation is that there may be a renewed focus on that space looking out into the future and whether those markets are operating in the competitive fashion that they need to. And that may very well produce new things that the enforcers are looking at.
I think that is, the bulk of the trends that we're seeing in the report. Is there, what can you say are the big takeaways from your enforcement report going forward? And
my takeaways are for the compliance professional. So I would say three things. One is, if I'm thinking about what areas I would want to invest my dollars in beefing up my compliance based on the trends we're seeing, one would be around the labor markets, right? So HR issues, HR policies, non-solicitation clauses, those kinds of things that go to the employment structure. Folks should spend some time focused on those because authorities are investing a lot of time and energy in looking for issues in that space. Two, if you're a company that engages in procurement activities with the government or otherwise, you should tighten up your controls, look at compliance around that procurement architecture. Again, because the government's investing a lot of time and energy there. And then finally, more on maybe the green field. If you are in an industry where you're thinking about things like sustainability or other things that you can do from an ESG perspective, and that's important to furthering the corporate goal, there may be some opportunities to have a discussion with authorities about ways that you can do that. And I think I would certainly be thinking about whether there are advancements that can be made with the authorities, working together with them to come up with some of these public interest exceptions, a business review letter in the US, for example, other things that you could do to get comfort that you can move forward with those kind of plans without having the risk of an antitrust enforcement action off the back of it.
Definitely some good practical tips to put in context what we're seeing here. And, I'm looking forward to seeing how all these things that you focused on in your report play out this year and going forward. So we always conclude with a bit of a fun section of our podcast. And we ask all our guests this: could you tell us something unusual or interesting about yourself that we wouldn't know from only knowing you in a professional setting?
Probably a lot of unusual things. I don't know how many of them are that interesting, but I would say probably a lot of people don't know I was a competitive swimmer in college. So spent a lot of years staring at the line of the bottom of a pool and very heavily chlorinated. So maybe that's what I would share. I don't do as much swimming now, a little bit more running than swimming, but that was a big part of my upbringing and passions once upon a time.
That's awesome. I've been trying hard to get my 3-year-old into swimming, so I'll let you know if I need any tips.
Yes.
Is there any advice that you would have for your 20-year-old self if you could, talk to him about your future career path?
Yeah, I would say I don't know that I would change so much of my career path. People who are interested in what I do, I certainly see a tremendous amount of value in spending time at the agency. That you are going to be defending against. One, so you get to know those people there and know the practice and policies. But two, because I think it helps you just as a well-rounded lawyer to sort of understand all of the issues that are at play. I think, the comment I would have for myself is take the time to learn from the people who are with you at the place where you are. And by that, I think all of us, when we come in professionally, are to rush to be the person out front, to be the voice who's speaking, to do the next big and greatest thing. I can tell you that I have become a dramatically better lawyer, not necessarily because I got to jump out front, but because I got to learn from some really fantastic people. So I think if I gave myself some advice, it would be slow down and learn from those people that are around you. It'll make you a much better lawyer.
That's awesome. And, another reason why it's so great that we get to do things like this and talk to people like you, and our listeners get the, chance to listen to you, even if, we may not be working together on a day-to-day basis. So it's been awesome hearing your thoughts on all these and your expertise. And thank you so much for coming on today.
Yeah, this was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of our Curious Amalgam, a competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law podcast. It is produced and shared around the globe by ABA's Antitrust Law Section. The opinions expressed by the participants in this podcast are their own and do not necessarily represent their employer or other organizations. If you like what you heard or would like to become a member of the American Bar Association, please check out what the Antitrust section has to offer at ambar.org/antitrust. You can learn more about our podcast at ourcuriousamalgam.com. If you have comments, suggestions, or podcast ideas, please reach out to us at podcast@ourcuriousamalgam.com. Until next time, thank you for listening.